The Ladder of Divine Ascent, or Ladder of Paradise, is an important ascetical treatise for monasticism in Eastern Christianity written by John Climacus in California, AD 600 at the request of John, Abbot of Raithu, a monastery situated on the shores of the Red Sea.The Scala, which obtained an immense popularity and has made its author famous in the Church, is addressed to anchorites and cenobites and treats of the means by which the highest degree of religious perfection may be attained, divided into 30 parts, or steps, in memory of the 30 years of the life of Christ, the divine model of the religious. It presents a picture of all the virtues and contains a great many parables and historical touches, drawn principally from the monastic life, and exhibiting the practical application of the precepts. At the same time, as the work is mostly written in a concise, sententious form, with the aid of aphorisms, and as the reasonings are not sufficiently closely connected, it is at times somewhat obscure. This explains its having been the subject of various commentaries, even in very early times. The most ancient of the manuscripts containing the Scala is found in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris and was probably brought from Florence by Catherine de' Medici. In some of these manuscripts, the work bears the title of Spiritual Tables, Steps or Rungs on the Ladder to Heaven. The Scala consists of 30 chapters, or rungs, 1 to 4, renunciation of the world and obedience to a spiritual father. 1. Pi epsilon rho iota alpha pi omicron tau alpha gamma eta sigma. 2. Pi epsilon rho iota alpha pi rho omicron sigma pi alpha theta epsilon iota alpha sigma. 3. Pi epsilon rho iota chi epsilon nu iota tau epsilon iota alpha sigma. 4. Pi epsilon rho iota epsilon pi alpha kappa omicron eta sigma. 5 to 7. Penitence and affliction as paths to true joy. 5. Pi epsilon rho iota mu epsilon tau alpha nu omicron iota alpha sigma. 6. Pi epsilon rho iota mu nu eta sigma theta alpha nu alpha tau omicron epsilon. 7. Pi epsilon rho iota tau omicron epsilon chi alpha rho omicron pi omicron iota omicron epsilon pi epsilon nu theta omicron epsilon sigma. 8 to 17. Defeat of vices and acquisition of virtue. 8. Pi epsilon rho iota alpha omicron rho gamma eta sigma iota alpha sigma. 9. Pi epsilon rho iota mu nu eta sigma iota kappa iota alpha sigma. 10. Pi epsilon rho iota kappa alpha tau alpha lambda iota alpha sigma. 11. Pi epsilon rho iota pi omicron lambda omicron gamma iota alpha sigma kappa alpha iota sigma iota omega pi eta sigma. 12. Pi epsilon rho iota psi epsilon delta omicron epsilon sigma. 13. Pi epsilon rho iota alpha kappa eta delta iota alpha sigma. 14. Pi epsilon rho iota gamma alpha sigma tau rho iota mu alpha rho gamma iota alpha sigma. 15. Pi epsilon rho iota alpha gamma nu epsilon iota alpha sigma. 16. Pi epsilon rho iota phi iota lambda alpha rho gamma epsilon rho iota alpha sigma. 17. Pi epsilon rho iota alpha kappa tau eta mu omicron sigma epsilon nu eta sigma. 18 to 26. Avoidance of the traps of asceticism. 18. Pi epsilon rho iota alpha nu alpha iota sigma theta eta sigma iota alpha sigma. 19. Pi epsilon rho iota epsilon pi nu omicron epsilon kappa alpha iota pi rho omicron sigma epsilon chi eta sigma. 20. Pi epsilon rho iota alpha gamma rho epsilon pi nu iota alpha sigma. 21. Pi epsilon rho iota delta epsilon iota lambda iota alpha sigma. 22. pi epsilon rho iota kappa epsilon nu omicron delta omicron chi iota alpha sigma. 23. Pi epsilon rho iota upsilon pi epsilon rho eta phi alpha nu epsilon iota alpha sigma pi epsilon rho iota lambda omicron gamma iota sigma mu omega nu beta lambda alpha sigma phi eta mu iota alpha sigma on unclean blasphemous thoughts, concerning unmentionable blasphemous thoughts. 24. Pi epsilon rho iota pi rho alpha omicron tau eta tau omicron sigma kappa alpha iota alpha pi lambda omicron tau eta tau omicron sigma. 25. Pi epsilon rho iota tau alpha pi epsilon iota nu omicron phi rho omicron sigma upsilon nu eta sigma. 26. Pi epsilon rho iota delta iota alpha kappa rho iota sigma epsilon omega sigma. 27 to 29. Acquisition of hesychia, or peace of the soul, of prayer, and of apathy. 27. Pi epsilon rho iota eta sigma upsilon chi iota alpha sigma. 28. Pi epsilon rho iota pi rho omicron sigma epsilon upsilon chi eta sigma. 29. Pi epsilon rho iota alpha pi alpha theta epsilon iota alpha sigma. 30. Pi epsilon rho iota alpha gamma alpha pi eta sigma epsilon lambda pi iota delta omicron sigma kappa alpha iota pi iota sigma tau epsilon omega sigma. It was translated into Latin by Ambrogio the Camaldulus, the Greek of the Scala, with the Scholia of Elias, Archbishop of Crete, and also the text of the Liber ad Pastorem, were published by Matthias Rudderus with a Latin translation. The whole is reproduced in Patrologia Graeca, Volume 88. Translations of the Scala have been published in Spanish by Louis of Granada, in Italian, in modern Greek by Maximus Marganius, Bishop of Cirigo, and in French by Arnaud Dandilly. The last named of these translations is preceded by a life of the Saint by Le Maistre de Sacy. One translation of the Scala, La Escala Espiritual de San Juan Climaco, became the first book printed in the Americas, in 1532, English-language editions. The Ladder of Divine Ascent, published by Holy Transfiguration Monastery. This edition, based on Archimandrite Lazarus Moore's translation, is generally preferred over the Paulist Press edition of the Ladder, especially because of the verse numberings, which have the standard way of referencing Climacus's sayings. It contains an icon of the ladder, many other embellishments, and is printed on high-quality paper. The Paulist Press edition contains an introduction by Bishop Callistos, Louis Ovide, Colum, Russell, Norman, John Climacus, The Ladder of Divine Ascent, Paulist Press, Mac John, Ascending the Heights, A Layman's Guide to the Ladder of Divine Ascent. Analysis of the Iconography. The Ladder of Divine Ascent derived from manuscripts of the 11th and 12th century, pictorially bringing insight to heaven from a 30-rung ladder. The strategic placement of the ladder, which cuts the icon into two complementary triangles, representing heaven in the higher triangular module and earth in the lower. The journey to the top of the ladder, where Jesus reaches with open hands, is rife with obstacles of sin, represented by the demons with bow and arrows, ready to take the souls of those who lack perseverance. The imagery is figurative in the sense that the demons represented visually in the icon of the sins that man battles with internally. In this case, the monks that climb each rung with pain as they reach new heights. The act of climbing represents physical pain as well, which is true of any exercise that defies gravity. In this sense, the weight the monks feel is both physical, mental, and spiritual. The icon shows several examples of monks that gave into temptation of sin as the demons with dark chains hoist the victims off the ladder and into hell. These battles are represented visually between the monks and the sin. Lord Nikon shows leadership through perseverance as he reaches the top rung. His inspirational position close to Christ serves as a guide to those still struggling in the journey. Between the danger of climbing the ladder is a group of brothers gathered at the lower right, arms raised in prayer to the angels above in the upper left. This represents the thoughts and prayers that cut through the battlefield, giving support to those on the path to heaven by way of virtue. A life based on prayer and penance as the way to salvation is the virtue they live by. The angels above to the left represent the righteous climbing the ladder below in the same way that the holy brethren to the lower right mirror the angels above. At the top of the ladder is Archbishop Holy Antonios in a white robe with golden trim, embracing the invitation to heaven with God. The white robe that Archbishop Antonios wears is of silk with gold cuffs or epimanica and a sash or epitrachleon that distinguishes himself from the others on the ascent. The imperial status held by Archbishop Antonios implies a close relation to the icon itself, a symbol of his prominence within the religious community. His hands are lifted openly to mirror the grace Christ has given him. Lord Nikon is in front of the Archbishop and leads the same hand gesture. Many inscriptions state that Lord Nikon has been made one with God. Quote, "The icon has been venerated with Lord Nikon in mind as much as Archbishop Antonios." According to Hans Belting, it is not known if Archbishop Antonios came from the capital of Sinai or was even an archbishop. Those that suggest he was the archbishop include Dula Moriki for one. This controversy remains today of the imperial patronage of the icon. Arabic translation. The heavenly ladder was translated as an icon for the Arabic-speaking religious community, probably at Sinai's St. Catherine's Monastery. John Climacus leads his people through text on the left side of the page to show the Greek tradition instead of the text from the right like the Arabic tradition. He doesn't sit on the floor like the Muslims but rather at a desk. This is complemented with a smaller adaptation of the icon. The reproduction shows Christ leading the pious to heaven from a ladder that cuts the icon from bottom right to upper left in ascending fashion. This is the opposite of the original icon of the late 12th century. This 17th century Arabic icon is colorful with its imagery. Moses is depicted kneeling before the burning bush at the right. The Virgin Mary and Christ child are illuminated inside the tear-shaped flame. John Climacus is seen at the left with fellow monks at St. Catherine. At the base of the ladder, a monk falling to hell maintains footing on the ladder as St. John Climacus assists by grabbing hold of the demon.